The gavel came down so hard the sound bounced off every wall in that courtroom, and my stepmother didn't even flinch. She just smoothed her blazer, leaned toward her attorney, and smiled at me the way you smile at something small and helpless that doesn't know it's already lost. I stood at the respondent's table alone, no attorney beside me, no family behind me. Just a yellow legal pad, a pen, and 28 years of being told I was nothing. Ms. Calloway. The judge peered down at me over his reading glasses. You understand you have the right to legal representation? Yes, Your Honor, I said. I've chosen to represent myself. My stepmother's attorney, a silver-haired man named Gerald Hurst, who had been practicing corporate law since before I was born, let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My stepmother covered her mouth with 2 fingers. My stepbrother sitting directly behind her didn't bother hiding his amusement at all. She can't even afford parking downtown, my stepbrother murmured. Just loud enough. And she thinks she can go up against Gerald Hurst. I wrote nothing on my legal pad. I just set the pen down, folded my hands, and waited. My father built Calloway Precision Manufacturing from a single rented machine in a warehouse in Ohio. By the time I was 10 years old, the company had 3 facilities and contracts with 2 of the largest aerospace suppliers in the country. By the time I was 16, my father had been named to the Forbes regional list of top manufacturers 2 years running. By the time I was 19, my father married Diana. Diana was everything my mother had not been: polished, strategic, and absolutely certain of what she wanted. She arrived in our lives with her son, my stepbrother Marcus, who was 22 and had already failed out of one business program and dropped out of another. Within 8 months of the wedding, Marcus had a VP title at my father's company. Within 14 months, he had a company credit card, a company car, and an office 3 doors down from my father's. I had a college fund and a pat on the head. I want to be fair. My father loved me. I genuinely believe that, but my father was a man who had spent his entire adult life building something, and Diana understood that the fastest way to his heart was to pretend to care about it the way he did. She sat through board presentations. She asked about supplier negotiations. She learned the language of the company fluently, and she used it like a passport into every corner of my father's world. I was his daughter. That apparently was a different category. When I graduated with my MBA at 24, summa cum laude, my father offered me a position as a junior analyst, not director of operations, which was what my degree and my internship history warranted. Junior analyst, the same title they had given to the 21-year-old they'd hired straight out of state school the previous spring. Diana had suggested it, my father explained. She thought it was important that I earn my place without any appearance of favoritism. Marcus, at that same moment, was being promoted to Chief Operating Officer. I took the junior analyst position. I showed up every day. I did the work, and then I did more work, and then I went home to my apartment on the east side of Columbus. Small, practical, nothing that would turn heads, and I did more work there. I built financial models in my spare time that the company never saw. I identified 3 supplier inefficiencies that were costing the company over $2 million annually, and submitted a full report to my father through the proper channels. The report came back to me with Marcus's name on the cover page. He had presented it to the board as his own analysis. I said nothing. I learned something instead. I learned that the most dangerous position is the one people don't believe you occupy. My father's first stroke happened on a Tuesday in March. I was in the building. I heard the commotion before anyone called me. I ran to his office and I held his hand until the paramedics arrived, and I rode in the ambulance while Diana sat in the back of a town car because she refused to be seen in an emergency vehicle. He recovered. Mostly, the left side of his face retained a slight droop, and his speech slowed, and something behind his eyes changed in a way I couldn't name but felt every time I looked at him. He came back to the office 4 months later, but he was not the same man who had left it. Diana, however, was ascendant. In the 18 months following my father's stroke, she restructured the board. 2 longtime directors who had been loyal to my father personally were quietly edged out and replaced with people whose primary qualification appeared to be their willingness to agree with Diana. Marcus's title changed from COO to president. My father retained the title of chairman, but he attended fewer and fewer meetings, and when he did attend, Diana sat beside him and answered questions that were directed at him. I watched all of this. I documented all of this. And I made phone calls that no one in that building knew I was making. The first call was to a woman named Patricia Chen, a former CFO who had left Calloway Precision 3 years earlier under circumstances that had always struck me as suspicious. The second call was to a corporate attorney named James Whitfield, who did not advertise and whose client list was, by design, impossible to find. The third call was to a private equity contact I had cultivated quietly during my MBA program, a man named Daniel Osei, who ran a small, meticulously private fund that specialized in distressed industrial acquisitions. I told no one. I went to work every morning as a junior analyst. I ate lunch alone at my desk. I drove home to my apartment with the drafty windows and the upstairs neighbor who practiced drums at 11 p.m., and I worked. My father died on a Wednesday in November 2 years and 4 months after his stroke. I was with him. Diana arrived 40 minutes later. Marcus did not come until the following morning. The will was read 10 days after the funeral. I sat in the conference room of my father's estate attorney and listened to Diana receive the primary residence, the vacation property in Vermont, and the majority of liquid assets. I listened to Marcus receive a substantial cash inheritance and a seat on the board formalized in perpetuity. I received a trust fund that would pay out in installments over 5 years, and a single sentence in the document that referred to my position at the company as something to be evaluated by the board at their discretion. Evaluated. By a board that Diana had rebuilt in her own image. I asked the estate attorney one question before I left. I asked whether my father had made any other arrangements, any documents executed in the last 18 months of his life, that were not part of the formal will. The attorney looked at his papers for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he looked at me and said carefully that he was not aware of any such documents. I thanked him. I went home. I called James Whitfield. "It's time," I said. The emergency board meeting was called 6 weeks after my father's death. The official purpose was to ratify Marcus's permanent appointment as CEO. Diana would assume the role of executive chair. The junior analyst position I had held for 4 years would be, as Marcus put it in the meeting notice, consolidated, which meant eliminated. I was invited to the meeting as a courtesy, or perhaps as an audience. The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Columbus skyline. My father had chosen this building partly for that view. He had told me once that he wanted to be able to see the whole city from where he worked, so he never forgot how big the world was outside his own 4 walls. I sat at the far end of the table. Diana sat at the head. Marcus sat to her right. Gerald Hurst sat against the wall with a leather portfolio on his knee. "Before we proceed," Diana said, looking at me with an expression that managed to be both pleasant and dismissive simultaneously, "I want to acknowledge how difficult these past weeks have been for everyone, particularly for family." She paused just long enough for the word to register as deliberate. "We all loved Richard." I nodded. That said, she opened her own portfolio. "The company requires stability, strong leadership, and the board is unanimous in its support of the transition structure we've outlined." Gerald Hurst rose and began distributing documents around the table. When he reached me, he set a single sheet in front of me, a notice of position elimination with a severance figure at the bottom, that was, given my 4 years of service and what my work had actually contributed, genuinely insulting. "We'd like this executed today," Marcus said. He was looking at his phone. I picked up the severance notice. I read it. I set it back down. "I have a few questions," I said. Diana's smile didn't change. "Of course. The board ratification you're seeking today, is this the full board? All 11 seats? All voting members," Gerald Hurst said. "Yes. And the transfer of executive authority, that's being executed under the standard corporate bylaws as amended last spring?" A brief pause. Gerald Hurst looked at Diana. "That's correct." I reached into the bag I had brought with me and removed a folder. I set it on the table and opened it. "I'd like to introduce something for the board's consideration," I said. "These are the Calloway Precision Corporate Bylaws as they existed prior to the amendments made last spring. I've had them reviewed by outside counsel." I slid a copy to the board member nearest me, specifically Article 9, Section 4, which states that any structural amendment to executive authority requires ratification by a two-thirds supermajority, not a simple majority, when the amendment is initiated within 24 months of the death or incapacitation of a founding shareholder. Silence. "My father died 6 weeks ago," I said. "That's well within the 24-month window?" Gerald Hurst's pen had stopped moving. He was reading his copy of the bylaw page with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, focused and slightly tight around the jaw. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'd like to present a second document." I removed it from the folder. "This is a share transfer agreement executed 14 months ago, notarized and filed with the Ohio Secretary of State. In it, my father transferred 31% of his personal Calloway Precision shares, not to the family trust, not to Diana, not to Marcus, but to a holding entity called Meridian Industrial Partners." I paused. "I am the sole managing member of Meridian Industrial Partners." The room went very quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has shifted and no one has fully processed it yet. Diana's hand, resting on the table, had stopped moving. Marcus looked up from his phone for the first time since the meeting began. "That gives me," I said, "a 31% ownership stake in this company. Combined with the 8% I've personally acquired in the secondary market over the past 2 years, I hold 39% of Calloway Precision Manufacturing." I closed the folder, which means that under Article 9, Section 4, no amendment to executive authority can be ratified today without my consent. Gerald Hurst stood up. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his knees are uncertain, and he looked across the table at me with an expression that had moved well past tight-jawed into something closer to disbelief. "Is that?" He stopped, started again. He turned to look at Diana. "Did you know about Meridian?" Diana's face had done something I had never seen it do. It had gone still. Not composed, still. The way a screen goes still when the connection drops. "Who are you?" Marcus said. He wasn't being rhetorical. He was asking genuinely, looking at me the way you look at someone you see every day and suddenly cannot place. "I'm your stepsister," I said. "I've been a junior analyst at this company for 4 years. I sat 3 offices down from you. I made $38,000 a year and ate lunch at my desk." I picked up the severance notice he had wanted me to sign and held it up briefly before setting it back down. "And I own 39% of this building." What followed was not a clean cinematic resolution. I want to be honest about that. There were 3 months of legal proceedings. Diana's attorneys challenged the validity of the share transfer, arguing that my father lacked capacity at the time of execution. We produced testimony from 2 neurologists, 3 colleagues who had met with him during that period, and the notary who had been present. A woman my father had specifically requested because he had known her for 15 years. The challenge failed. There were board votes and board reconstitutions and emergency shareholder meetings in conference rooms that smelled like stale coffee and anxiety. There were phone calls from Marcus that I did not return, and 1 phone call from Diana that I did return, during which she said things that I will not repeat here because they were, ultimately, not important. What was important was that Daniel O'C's fund, in the weeks following my disclosure, exercised an option I had quietly arranged 6 months earlier, acquiring an additional 12% of Calloway Precision shares from a retiring board member who had grown uncomfortable with Diana's direction. Combined with my 39%, we held a controlling position. The board meeting that mattered happened on a gray Tuesday in February, 4 months after my father's death. Diana sat at the head of the table again. But this time, she knew what was coming. James Whitfield sat beside me. On my other side sat Patricia Chen, the former CFO who had left the company under suspicious circumstances and who had agreed, after our many long phone calls, to return as an independent director. Across the table, 3 of Diana's 4 appointed board members sat with the expressions of people who had done the political math and come to an unpleasant conclusion. The vote was 4-2. Marcus, in a rare exercise of judgment, did not vote. He stared at the window and said nothing. Diana was removed as executive chair. Marcus's CEO appointment was voided under Article 9. I was named interim CEO pending a 60-day transition review, at the end of which the full board would vote on a permanent appointment. The 60-day review resulted in the permanent appointment. I'm telling you this, not because I want you to admire what I did. I'm telling you because for 4 years I sat in that building and people looked through me. I brought my best work and watched it get repackaged under someone else's name. I watched my father's company get quietly redirected toward people who had not built it, had not understood it, had not lost sleep over it. And I made a choice, early and deliberately, that I would not fight loudly. I would build quietly. I would learn the mechanisms, and I would be patient, and I would be ready. My father was not a perfect man. He made choices in those last years that hurt me in ways I'm still working through. But he also made one phone call, 14 months before he died, on a Tuesday afternoon when Diana was at a charity luncheon and Marcus was in a meeting he was poorly prepared for. He called me into his office and he closed the door, and he put a folder on the desk between us, and he said, "I need you to know I always saw you." That folder was the share transfer agreement. I have it framed now. It hangs in the office on the 14th floor, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows, where you can see the whole city and remember how big the world is outside your own 4 walls. My father's office. My office. The day Marcus cleared out his desk, he stopped in the hallway outside my door. He stood there for a moment, and I looked up, and I waited. "Dad always liked you better," he said finally. It came out quiet, without venom. Almost confused. "I know," I said. He left. I went back to work. If you're watching this, and you're in the middle of something like what I went through, not the corporate mechanics of it, but the feeling of it. The standing in a room where everyone looks past you, the grinding slow work of believing in yourself when no one around you is bothering to. I want to tell you something. The most dangerous position is the one people don't believe you occupy. Let them underestimate the position. Build the position anyway, and when the time comes, you won't need to announce yourself. The documents will do it for you. Don't forget to subscribe to CloverRevenge, and I'll see you in the next story.